Oi!
We live in a world of rapidly rising and transforming threats on many fronts, some embodying very unexpected dimensions. I'm Dee Smith, and in this episode of A World on the Brink, we are going to look at some of the most significant threats in our world today, from nuclear, biological, and most recently cyber warfare, to the threats related to our resources and systems, and finally, to perhaps the greatest threat of all, the enemy within. Given this vast array of threats, I want to understand how they are evolving, how they interrelate, and how we may be able to cope with them. We will first look at war, and specifically, nuclear war. The specter of nuclear weapons has haunted the world since their use at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. For decades after the end of World War II, there were just 5 nuclear powers, but this has grown over time. Today, some analysts count as many as 20 governments possessing nuclear or near-nuclear capabilities. Over time, new technologies become accessible to more and more nations. Nuclear technology is now more than 70 years old, and we face a future where more and more nations will acquire a technology that is capable of completely destroying human civilization. Although nuclear arsenals have shrunk by more than 2/3 since their peak numbers in the 1980s, there are still estimated to be almost 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, about 93% of which are owned by the US or Russia. A great power war seemed for many years to be the most probable scenario for nuclear conflict, and it looked likely that it would occur as a result of a miscalculation.
We know from World War I, we know from World War II, great power wars are the most long-term destabilizing, costly, harmful things to the global system. And if there is another great power war, which I worry most about between the United States and China, that would be the single worst thing that could happen for many, many different factors. So my hope is that China and the United States, as a rising and I would say plateauing great power, find a way to cooperate on the areas that they disagree with and actually decide to have I would say, a more friendly and productive relationship between each other. But right now, there's not a lot of political incentive for either states to do so. The good news is that many of U.S. interests are embedded in this global international order, and it has formal military alliances and informal relationships with lots of countries in East and South Asia. So China would pay a larger price if it chose to go to war with the United States. Similarly, the United States would pay a price if it chose to initiate a preventive war with China, because the rest of the world is not just going to watch and say, this is between you two, right? They're going to penalize the country that they perceive to be the aggressor, either with sanctions, with political pressure, with refusing to trade at the same degree they are. So there are more, I would say, international normative and formal constraints to great power wars than there were in the past.
In the context of a crisis between the US and Russia, there are a number of scenarios you can imagine whereby for example, a use it or lose it kind of moment, right? Where Russia thinks that unless it pushes the button, it might actually not have the opportunity to do so. And Russia worries about these kinds of things, believe it or not. Or another plausible, or not totally impossible scenario is if there is a conventional war in Europe. Again, starting with a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation or a mistake that escalates, and that Russia ends up losing. You know, it has in its arsenal what's called non-strategic nuclear weapons, battlefield nuclear weapons. I would not exclude that under circumstances like that, where, to quote the Russian military doctrine, the very existence of the state is threatened, that they would resort to it. You know, the same goes for the U.S. to a certain extent in the context of a crisis with Russia. I think all cards are off the table.
Nuclear weapons may make a war between the great powers less likely. But as the technology spreads to numerous less powerful nations, the likelihood that they will be used in conflict increases. Most concerning today is North Korea, which has now developed a military capability, both nuclear and conventional, which, coupled with the reputation they have intentionally developed for being reckless and unpredictable, makes it very hard for South Korea or the U.S. to threaten them. While this approach of looking both mad and powerful may work to dissuade attack, it also increases mistrust and suspicion. It makes it more probable that a miscalculation could lead to a horrific outcome. It has been observed that North Korea exists in the margins of diplomacy, in a kind of empty space that the U.S. and China have left open over the decades. Still today, China has many reasons to resist pressuring North Korea as much as the U.S. wants them to.
The North Koreans do respect strength, and they'll exploit weakness. So any weakness in the position, in the alliance, I think North Korea is going to want to exploit. What motivates them is just regime survival. And the realization, that stark realization that they would never stand on their own 2 feet as a form of government. From the Chinese perspective, it's a buffer. You know, it's a buffer from Western influences. And so they want that buffer along their border. From the South Korean perspective, it's reunification. And so you've got now all the variables here in place for an impasse. And I don't know how you move beyond that unless you address the core issue from 1953, which is, you know, what does it take to end the war rather than just simply sign the armistice? I think it's fear of North Korea retaliating against the South, that Seoul is within range of all of the North Korean technology, artillery, and weaponry, and that the losses would be too great to withstand. And so it was easier in the minds of the South Koreans to tolerate provocations, loss of life, than to deal with the potential for a real conflict on the peninsula.
But nuclear weapons are only one of the growing and astonishing array of threats we face today as a world, as nations, and also as individuals.
I think the vulnerability has increased by orders of magnitude just in the last 10 years. When you think about North Korea, for example, the real concern that we have about North Korea is that they're a proliferator. So it's one thing for them to develop nuclear capability for themselves. It would be another thing entirely if they're developing nuclear capability and exporting it to different groups in the Middle East. You can imagine all kinds of different ways that this can play out. And that's why there has to be such a tight sort of watch on North Korea, particularly in the maritime domain. Anytime their ships are out, we have to be watching very closely in terms of where they're going and what they're doing.
And this is where globalization comes in. You have a public health crisis in Nigeria, and a return of Ebola. Do you think it doesn't get to the West potentially? You don't think that, those planes travel every day? Can you stop people crossing borders, with these health crises? I mean, to me, this is where globalization means these things are no longer contained. You can no longer just say that's happening over there. It's not just health. I mean, look at Boko Haram. Look at what's happened with extremist groups setting up shop in these African states. Failed states are fertile ground for extremist organizations. And then we see, it comes back to hurt us.
The greatest concern in the longer term is the democratization of hacking, genetically engineered biological threats, and potentially robotics. Because initially, these were things that only massive national state governments could do. You had to be a member of the national labs, the United States, or an intelligence service, or a military agency in another country. Now, what the NSA could do 10 years ago, you can go find on the internet and try to introduce into your neighbor's computer network. It has become more democratized. It is now available at much lower levels.
With cyber war, we have entered an entirely new age, exploiting types and levels of vulnerabilities that have arisen from our network, computer-driven world, a type of warfare that was inconceivable in previous generations.
There is such a level of cyber weaponry being developed now that eventually I do believe that some of it will be used because you can use it and think that you'll be able to get away with it. That's the real problem with cyber conflict, is that it seems possible to harm your enemy without having to pay a price for it. And what will happen is that both the weaponry will develop and it'll be more damaging, and at the same time, the possibility for counterattacks will proportionally increase. That's a line that has been crossed a little bit, but not too much. When that line is crossed, then you begin to see real conflict, cyber conflict between states.
And these things will only become cheaper, more easily to distribute as all of us connect every single thing to the internet, and it will be able to persist on computer networks for longer, undetected, and transmit back data that you might want to keep secure. They can spoof your communications, pretend you are communicating with someone when you aren't. They can decide to disrupt any communication you have with sort of anybody.
The rise of ideology, and now the impact that individuals can have in the strategic environment. You can take that one step further, this theme of lowering the barrier to entry now into the world of cyber. Because now that's what you see. This is no longer a resource, a capability, or a scenario that involves nation-state players. Now it's individuals. They can have all kinds of different motivations, whether it's politically motivated, nationalistic in its motivation, or economic and financial gain. But now the barrier for entry into a space that was normally reserved for nation states is now taking place at the individual level.
When the barriers to entry are lowered, non-state actors such as ISIS, or even individuals, can mount highly significant attacks. But what kind of damage exactly can cyber conflict inflict? Is it limited to theft of personal or corporate information? Or can it move far beyond that?
So what's happened since 1997 is the spectrum in the way we conceptualize the range of military operations has spread. And it's opened up an aperture now that there's more people playing, and the place that they're playing is not just national security, but it's corporate security and it's personal security.
There's an enormous potential for cyber conflict to do extreme damage. That is absolutely true. The likelihood of non-state actors being able to do that kind of extreme damage is relatively low. But the likelihood of a non-state actor being able to hijack 3 planes and successfully fly 2 of them in the World Trade Center and 1 into the Pentagon, that's a low likelihood too. So to say that it's a low likelihood doesn't mean that it's irrelevant.
There are examples where, and we've seen in Asia Pacific, where adversaries have hidden in the networks for more than 500 days. So it takes just 2 or 3 days for an adversary to start collecting information. And you talk about having an impact on the real world. If your adversary knows your negotiating strategy, if your adversary knows your diplomatic notes, if your adversary knows what your competitive advantage is and can see you from idea to production, then whether we're talking about something in the manufacturing sector or something in a diplomatic circle, you can see in terms of real world impact that cyber has a way of changing outcomes that we never thought about before. In many respects, from many different perspectives now, the information age has introduced concepts that are introducing a number of variables that we've never considered before, we've never had to procure against. And it challenges our conceptualization of the role of government as well as the private sector.
But the greatest risk is posed by the computerization and networking of major infrastructure, and that includes the electrical grid.
There's also the issue about vulnerability of infrastructure to attack, to malicious attack, and that's becoming much more of a concern. So many of our big operations in developed countries, whether they be power stations, railways, all manner of things, are controlled by computers. And if computers are attackable, the governments of the developed world are quite seriously worried about the vulnerability of the infrastructure. You know, in the wrong hands, the cyber attack potential is really quite serious. Probably the most important piece of infrastructure that everybody takes for granted is power. You know, we all absolutely depend on electric power. The interruption of power supply on a major scale, I don't just mean for a few hours or for 24 hours, but I mean for weeks, could be extraordinarily damaging to the fabric of society. So quite quickly, people's mobile phone charge disappears. They can't recharge them. They can't communicate. The ATM machines stop working. People couldn't get cash. Delivery of power is only the total amount of power available. There's only a relatively small margin over the amount of power that's actually being asked for. And so if they get that wrong, you have power cuts, you have power outages. All of that is under a very sophisticated control system, and all of that is potentially vulnerable. Once you accept that nearly all of these operations are run by computers, and once you accept the principle that computers are hackable, all manner of things begin to cascade once you do without electric power for a significant period. And that's, to my mind, probably the biggest vulnerability, that if our power stations were in some way prevented from delivering the power, and if it was for any significant period of time, that would be it would pose a major threat to our society's fabric as we know it.
Every computerized system is vulnerable. Even the U.S. National Security Agency can't make its systems entirely secure. And a key element of the vulnerability is the iterative nature of cyber attacks. They can be mounted against the same systems over and over again, eroding the ability to recover. In a cyber war, as in any other, the attacked nation would respond in kind. But in a cyber war, it can be impossible to know who you've been attacked by.
With the introduction of cyber, you have more proxies that are working on behalf of governments. Attribution is really difficult in cyber. It can be done. It typically involves the collection of forensic evidence and takes a while in order to be able to walk it back and to figure out who is behind certain activities that have taken place in cyber. Not sure that really matters, whether it's a nation state or a proxy of a nation state, in terms of which laptop or which desktop this came from. The world that we're in today is one that requires us, I think, to have the right sort of means of defending ourselves. And it calls into question now, what role will government play in cyber?
There is absolutely no preparation for that politically. There is no treaty body. There are no mostly no talks going on of any great significance. And you have all of these states that have fallen into the view that conflict basically won't occur, that it's a bit of a game. And my feeling is that at some point it'll no longer be a game, and then it will be, then we will have geopolitical conflict on a serious scale.
The way I would think about an all-out cyber war, they can go to your open flank. So you can be looking at escalatory actions, and that's when the ATMs go down, or that's when the financial sector is hit, or public utilities are hit. I mean, this is the concern, is that it's unbounded, and there's so many vulnerabilities in so many areas. You can imagine scenarios where escalation reaches a point where it's no longer under control. We have a way of thinking that we can initiate and control escalation, and then we can de-escalate when we're ready to de-escalate. The adversary gets a vote in that, and when you get into the world of cyber, you open the door now to something that it's not necessarily clear when this is going to stop or how it's going to stop.
But even barring a true cyber war or a devastating cyber attack, the reality of cyber vulnerability is changing the discussion about the nature of privacy and security. Companies are now attacked on a daily basis. The typical business in the U.S. is attacked 4 million times a year. And of course, the personal data of millions of individuals can be stolen and deployed for criminal financial gain. It is said that the system of usernames and passwords offers essentially no real personal data protection and is simply a part of what is known as security theater, which exists to make people feel better and to provide some legal cover for companies whose data is stolen. It is almost impossible to estimate the economic and strategic losses that businesses and governments in the West have incurred from the theft of intellectual property and the application of it in another country.
The ability to inject malicious software, to corrupt devices, to spoof, to hack is just growing exponentially. We like the internet because it provides us, again, with lots of opportunities. It gives us lots of advantages in our lives, but it also puts us at tremendous risk and vulnerability. Basically, any allegedly secured system can be hacked and broken into pretty easily, and I think you're going to see that happening in more and more real time with greater consequence.
If you look at the introduction of the Chinese aircraft carrier and their ability to mate an air wing onto the carrier deck and then operate, the amount of time that took, that didn't come from proficiency. That came from lessons learned from other countries like the United States, where all that information is just stolen and then incorporated into the way of doing things for the Chinese. So when Sony gets hacked, and it's quite clear by the level of destructiveness that takes place with their computer hardware that a nation state's involved, what does the government do? Increasingly, public institutions and private enterprise are demanding more from government in terms of being responsive. In the absence of government's response, then corporations come forward and go, should we hack back? Should we be the ones that form the line of deterrence? And that introduces the potential for real escalation that goes beyond any kind of control. And I think what we end up doing is we find a way in the meantime, until we sort out the role of government and the private sector working together, to work closely with law enforcement.
The threats from cyber attack are widely reported in the mainstream media and are therefore quite well known. And we are just now gaining a better understanding of how devastating a true cyber war could be. But now, I want to explore one of the most unknown and terrifying types of warfare. Bioweapons share with nuclear weapons the potential to cause destruction to human life on a massive scale. But unlike a nuclear bomb, a bioweapon can be created in a garage with off-the-shelf equipment and relatively easy-to-obtain biological agents. And because of this, biological warfare is not limited to large state-based players.
There are technologies that are emerging now that can do spectacular things. Synthetic biology, for instance, where you can create entirely new life forms. And that promises to have incredible therapeutic benefit. It's on balance overwhelmingly positive. The only problem is you can also use that technology to create pathogens that have no known antidote, or to create bioweapons that could inflict enormous amounts of damage, catastrophic damage on other countries or your own country. What's happened is that governments aren't even keeping up with domestic regulation of those things, much less international regulation. There's no global governance when it comes to synthetic biology.
The biothreats is just one that it's hard to even wrap your head around, because you could have genetically engineered biological viruses released into the world that we don't know the DNA of. They're being kept secret, and then you have to wait till lots of people are infected until you can try to find an antidote, try to trace it back to its source and eliminate it. But again, what used to only be, you could only create in labs over many years, you'll be able to create in literally your garage with some technical capability and know-how in shorter and shorter time periods.
Whether conventional, cyber, or biological, war is always unpredictable. But war is started and pursued by human beings. Mother Nature, on the other hand, is a law unto herself and is capable of producing overwhelming threats that can be equally unpredictable and equally destructive. Diseases and natural disasters can happen at any time. And of course, there is now the ever-looming threat of climate change.
Climate change threats, which are becoming increasingly concerning, so that we have quite a number of issues in the UK and in Europe, but also the US, of course, notably Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And these large weather events are incredibly damaging to our infrastructure, and they're getting more frequent.
Environmental degradation and the consequences that has, not the planet ending tomorrow, but the effects that changing weather patterns have upon migration, upon social order. There's a very direct correlation among these issues, and I'm concerned that we're seeing these changes starting to happen more rapidly.
Well, I came from the Pacific, so I was on the Pacific islands that are most affected by climate change, and you can see dramatic shifts in terms of what the implications are for them. So, you know, a future in the Marianas, a future in the Pacific Islands is now called into question because, you know, they can see the sea taking back their islands, you know, feet at a time. In terms of the weather conditions that we see, I think for me, especially watching the impact of typhoons coming through Typhoon Alley, it's the intensity of the storms that has really picked up. And so we're seeing a lot more damage and then a lot more need for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. There's implications, of course, when it comes to national security associated with it. But the most dramatic rise, I think, has been associated with those who suffer the consequences of some of the weather systems that come through.
I was at this amazing meeting, the OPEC seminar, a couple years ago. And it couldn't be more interesting when you had the Chinese representative on a panel, it was consuming country panel. And China essentially said, look, don't look to China as the engine for growth for traditional hydrocarbons. We are very concerned about climate change from a national security perspective. So we are all about electric vehicles, alternative sources of energy. We see this again as a national security issue. So I think for China, this wasn't because they were so concerned about the rest of the world necessarily, they took the lead on climate change. It was because it was a domestic issue.
Perhaps the largest natural threat relates to water. It is a fierce problem with many variables. Rising sea levels themselves not only threaten coastal areas, but a hypercharged water cycle driven by higher temperatures produces storms that can inundate cities. If giant coastal cities become uninhabitable or uninsurable, this may in turn precipitate a refugee crisis on a scale beyond anything we've ever seen. When most people think about water, they envisage shortages of water. These may grow so acute that they become a primary cause of war.
As much as any political driver, water is, of course, absolutely crucial to the survival of the planet. We have a major population problem. The most significant factor is that the urbanization of our population has become, really very acute. So if you go back to about 1950, only about 1/3 of the world's population was urban. By 2050, which is not very far ahead, 2/3 of the world's population will be urban. But that's 2/3 of a much bigger number too. So I would say probably the greatest engineering challenge for the human race, because of this massive increase in urbanization. And much of that is, of course, in developing countries.
I think there are parts of the world where population is growing faster than the water table can support it. But I worry about another era of droughts. And droughts correlate with conflict, right? People fight over these kinds of resources. And so this is, I think, a big problem. And it's not just a problem in lesser developed areas, it's a problem in developed societies as well.
At the time a lot of our infrastructure was built, nobody was thinking about climate change. Within 40 years, the rise in sea levels and the change in climate have been significant, very significant. And there is quite clearly, and of course London is just one example of many cities, but many of our cities in the world are built either on rivers or on the coast or both, for good historical reasons. And so flooding is a major issue, and it's becoming ever more critical. Countries like Bangladesh, flooding is just catastrophic already, and the Dutch are extremely, probably the best in the world at managing this process, and they're constantly having to raise their flood defenses, reinforce them, check them out, make sure they're not vulnerable. And that's it's a feature everywhere, where there are rivers and where there are coastal cities. The positive side of all this is that the human race is a very adaptable species, and I think that the one thing one can say about climate change and rising sea levels is it's a pretty slow process. And so just as this is happening in a slow way, so that flood defenses can be raised, measures taken. But one has to then also think of the possibility of failure of flood defenses. And Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans was a classic example of that. So sewage is another really interesting and perhaps not such an attractive part of our infrastructure, but we have to think about that. What happens to it when it disappears down the toilet? Where does it go? It gets pumped. So all of that would become, if that was threatened in some way, that could become very serious as well.
One can imagine the horror of a major city without toilets and without sanitation. But that nightmarish scenario could be the direct result of a combination of problems with power supplies that have been struck, for example, by a massive cyber attack, and a city's water supply that has been affected by the power cuts, and then the medical crisis that results from a lack of sanitation and lack of availability of medical care. As another example, what happens if, after an attack on the financial system, no money is available from cash machines and cards do not work, and then groceries and gasoline and other supplies cannot be bought, and business comes to a standstill? How long would such a situation remain stable or peaceful? What happens in a world of just-in-time inventory if a massive storm destroys a major port that is a transshipment point supplying many other places, which cannot quickly or cheaply be replicated elsewhere. These examples illustrate the kind of sensitivity and brittleness we have built into the system 100 times over. But more important, the lesson here is that it is often when multiple problem sets intersect with each other that the most intense and devastating manifestations can be produced. Is the reason a large section of the American public are so disinterested in climate change simply because they have not yet experienced its effects as badly as people in other countries? And is this itself not just a typical facet of the human condition, where we are so focused on our short-term satisfaction, so married to the way we do things, to the resources we think we just can't live without, that we simply cannot or will not change until the effects land squarely on our own doorstep? These questions take me to the final area of risk in this episode, risks that arise from the way we think about things, and these may be the biggest risks of all.
We forever have been uncomfortable with information that disconfirms our previously held beliefs. That is not something new, right? That has existed before. We had Twitter, Facebook, the internet. But now we can filter that out quite quickly, because if you look at younger individuals and you look at source on polling data, where do you get information about the world? It's primarily based upon, it used to be based upon late night TV shows, and they don't even watch them anymore. So it's primarily Facebook. After that, it's Twitter, and after that, it's just conversations with friends. And your friends likely also read the same Facebook and Twitter feeds that you do, so you probably have similar perceptions.
I think a lot of what we think and believe is determined by the way we talk about it, the way we label things, and the way we interpret them. The world is not prima facie. It's very interpretive.
Fake news is nothing new in fake news. We've seen it in propaganda from in wartime Italy to Germany to Russia. There's always been propaganda machines. What's different is that we've seen politicians who are part of the bedrock of Western democracies seeming to undermine the trust in information. When you have Michael Gove saying people in this country have had enough of experts. When you have Kellyanne Conway, Donald Trump's aide, dismissing what was pure fantasy by her president and allowing it to be seen as alternative facts, you are in this extraordinary position where you don't know which is Alice and which is the Wonderland. There is an alarming tendency for people to have a disregard for the truth. Donald Trump has been astonishing in his looseness with what is evidently not fact. I mean, there's a story of his butler at Mar-a-Lago who'd been told that the tiles in the nursery in that Florida house were made personally by Walt Disney. And when Trump asked the butler whether it was true, Trump's answer was, "Who cares?" Now, the story becomes more important than the fact under his mantra.
But what makes us believe things that are demonstrably untrue? Why do we convince ourselves so utterly of things that are so clearly wrong?
The first thing is to realize just how powerful stories are. So if I were just to say to you, once upon a time, it gets your attention immediately, rather than saying, well, according to the latest data, 3% of Americans believe this and 55% believe that. That turns people off pretty quickly. It may not turn academics off, policymakers, but it turns a lot of people off. But once upon a time is something that gets everybody. And I think we're just wired that way. So in every case that we can, we should try to tell a story. Here's how it began. Here's how the Middle East got to where it was today. Those kinds of stories are important. And when you frame something in a story, you can get the main point that you want to get across much easier. I think part of it is that you believe something so strongly that to have it repudiated is very, very difficult. But I also think there's something else going on, which is maybe simpler, which is that our brains are constructed, or have been over time through evolution, in a way that makes us very kind of quick deciders.
I remember on the night of the referendum, texting George Osborne, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was hopeful and almost confident that the Remain would win. I remember having a similar conversation late evening with the editor of the Times. I think the whole world woke up with a completely new formula on how our future was going to be aligned and realigned with Europe and the rest of the world. And we ended up with a ferocious battle for power at the top of the Conservative Party, with people being stabbed in the back and vicious foul play, which would make Julius Caesar seem like a nursery play. And it led to the surprising rise of Theresa May as our Prime Minister, a Remain, albeit a reluctant campaigner in that referendum. She was known as the submarine because she rarely put her head above the surface by some of her critics. But here she is now, a fervent believer with her famous mantra, Brexit means Brexit.
I think the last thing that a head of state wants to do is to telegraph weakness or indecision. And so once a point of action or a point of activity is identified, it's very difficult to reverse it. We also have, I think, cultural biases. For example, famously, I think Vice President Cheney was quoted as saying the Iraqis will greet us with flowers and waving American flags. And that really didn't turn out to be the case at all. Some of that came, I think history will reflect, from sources within Iraq and Iraqi exiles like Ahmed Chalabi, who were feeding this line to an administration that was only too happy to believe it.
So why are we so susceptible to stories? Why do we need to invent and then tell and retell ourselves narratives that are incomplete or simply false?
I think it's true that we are victims of the best storyteller. But what's important is that we understand our vulnerability to really good storytelling. I think that's the key. So we're not kind of hapless victims to whoever tells the best story, but we need to get beyond the story and say, well, why am I reacting to this as strongly as I am reacting to it? What's going on here? But morality binds and blinds, so that our affinity to the group binds us, that's good, but it also blinds us to let's say, the benefits, the assets of other groups. And if we begin to understand that, then maybe we'll have a more open mind to what people on the other side think. So if I'm a Republican, maybe I'll think, I'm actually kind of emotionally opposed to ideas that come from Democrats just because they come from Democrats. That's kind of weird. Why would that be? Well, it's actually the way my brain is wired. When you feel yourself emotionally responding to political events or even policy positions, to me that's a warning. That says, hey, there's something wrong here. Or I'm responding in a way that is really kind of out of my control, and I need to sit back and think about it.
I think you have to escape from your Facebook and Twitter feed if you really want to find other sources of information, because they are really good at, through their algorithms, at finding things that speak exactly to you.
There's absolutely no doubt that social media feeds into this, let's call it a problem. We give very little attention to specific issues. We're moving very quickly from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And that only reinforces this method of decision making.
The best way to respond to false accounts and intentionally distorted accounts is to be attentive to evidence. How do you know what you know? It's more important how you make your argument. And I think a good lawyer would say the same thing also, right? You can make the argument that agrees with me, but you can make it very poorly. And in fact, if you want to impress me, make the argument that disagrees with my argument and make it in an impressive way. And that's really, really extraordinary. So it's how you make the argument. The bad leader is the one who's only reading the last chapter of the book that has the conclusions. The good leader wants to get in and at least get his or her hands dirty and understand, how did you get to this argument? I, for one, love reading historical accounts where I'm surprised or disagree with the final outcome, because it gets me to think. I might still not be persuaded, but it gets me to think through why I believe what I believe.
Recent research has demonstrated that confronting someone with documented evidence refuting a deeply held belief can actually make them hold that belief even more strongly. Believing what we want to, or what it feels good to believe about markets, has a huge effect on them, and a huge effect on investors. And of course, this is anything but rational.
And anyone in the world of financial markets should know this. I mean, markets are driven more than anything else by perceptions, and perceptions are constructed. I remind students all the time that the soundness of the U.S. dollar is as much perceptual as anything else. Let's hope that perception remains in place. Let's hope we continue to construct it.
Particularly countries that are heavily focused on natural resources. You know, in many respects, they don't have to have better governance to stay in power. If you are a head of state in a hydrocarbon producing country, what really matters is you control the dispersal of patronage, of money to hold everything together. In countries that don't have natural resources, I think you have to be much more focused on tax collection. If you have tax collection to feed your state, you know, your revenue machine, then people ask for a greater say in how they're governed.
So why do investors miss the cues so often? It seems many people believe what they want to believe because it makes them feel good for the short term. It is very common to make false judgments that can then have dramatic and negative financial repercussions. So what accounts for such irrational behavior? Again, the energy business provides a perfect example.
They're market participants who believe that everything defaults towards rationality in the end. That essentially everyone needs to exploit a resource. There may be some conflict over it, but ultimately people will come together because if they don't set aside their differences, that resource won't be exploited. And I'm always trying to push back on that, because I take a country like Libya. You have many people saying, well, Libya is going to get its act together because they have this oil resource. If these people fight over it, no one's going to get the money. So that's going to cause them to come together. And I always say, what is the average duration of the Civil War in a post-Second World War period? And people don't know the answer. And I say, it's 10 years. What moves you beyond 10 years? Foreign sponsorship of the combatants, because then you really don't need to exploit the natural resource because somebody is funding your conflict. And I say, look, we're only now in year 6 of the Libyan civil war. We probably have 4 more years to go. And considering that we have outside actors funding rival sides, we may extend beyond 10 years. So why do you think this country is suddenly going to be out of the woods? And so we're always in this situation where people look to say, well, oil production is going to come back in Libya. And I say, Libyan oil production is onshore. It's not like Angola, which was offshore and could remain intact even though there was a civil war. I mean, that resource is going to be held hostage to the fighting. So why do you keep expecting the situation to improve? And so I'm always sort of fighting a battle with other oil analysts who keep saying, it defaults to rationality. I mean, what I think a lot of investors do is they mirror themselves onto the rest of the world. And so if you're sitting in Texas or New York or London, you oftentimes think the rest of the world looks like everything around you, and not understanding that elites in these countries who make these decisions, they're playing by a different set of rules with different conditions. And so what I always say to investors is, stop thinking like a board member of an E&P company and start thinking about running a large petrostate where essentially you stay in power because you use that money to ensure the military doesn't rise up against you, members of the family doesn't rise up against you, unemployed kids don't go into the streets. Your incentives, if you put yourselves in the shoes of a Middle Eastern head of state or an African petrostate leader, will be different than a board member of an oil company.
So where does this leave us? We face a world bristling with threats. The technologies of war are changing fast, and new weapons like cyber and biological threats, as well as the devastating 20th century nuclear threat, are spreading to combatants that are small states or are not even states. The barriers to entry for weapons of vast destructive power are lower than ever before and are still going down. Astonishingly devastating weapons can now fall into the hands of terrorist groups. At the same time, the complexity of the systems we have created and our reliance on technologies like the internet increase vulnerabilities. And it becomes impossible to know where the weak links are, exactly how we are exposed, and what hidden connections may manifest themselves when the system is attacked or disturbed. But it is the unintended consequence that is perhaps of most concern. This is particularly true of war and even nuclear war, which could more easily happen by miscalculation now than at any time since the end of the Cold War. A simple misreading of intentions in a hostile environment could lead to a war that kills millions. But we are miscalculating in areas that go far beyond the domain of war. And all of this is occurring in the face of threats related to resources. In this episode, we examined water, but it is just one of many interrelated threats. Agriculture, for example, is facing its own crisis because of soil exhaustion. Some recent studies estimate that, unless something changes, we may have only 60 years of harvest left. And biological threats are not just related to weaponization of microorganisms. Naturally occurring diseases that remained isolated for millennia are now being brought potentially into global circulation as networks of roads and air connections bring more and more remote regions into immediate contact with the outside world. Whatever its cause, climate change is upon us, whether we want to admit it or not. And the effects of this can be almost inconceivable. Consider the kind of mass migration of people inland that could result from the serious and irrevocable flooding of the great coastal cities of the world. New York, Shanghai, Miami, London, Mumbai, Houston, Jakarta, the list is almost endless. No system and no government could successfully deal with the consequences. We've created a world with opposing characteristics. It is very robust in some ways and very fragile in others. And our technology is also a double-edged sword. While it has solved many problems, it has created at least as many, and it has effects we cannot predict. And based on our technology, modern hyperconnectivity and globalization have transformed the world into one in which nations and people are intimately connected, one in which markets now move in tandem, and one in which events in one place can affect the politics, finances, health, and stability of many other places, essentially instantaneously. In other words, it is a world of contagion in almost every way. In fact, we face a continuum of threats that reinforce one another as our world becomes increasingly unstable and unpredictable. And not only have we scarcely begun to address these issues, but with the recent trend in many nations to pursue a more isolationist approach, we have to ask if this increases risk at a time when it feels more than ever that we need cooperation. Cooperation is really the only means and the only hope we have of mitigating even parts of this vast web of threats. None of the major threats respect national borders, and they cannot be solved by sovereign nation states acting alone. Many people do not want to hear this, or may refuse to hear it, but that does not keep it from being true. And this brings us face to face with perhaps our greatest threat, ourselves. And that specifically means the way we think about things and make decisions. Many problems could be solved, or might never have arisen, if we had cultivated different ways of thinking and reacting. We have created the most complex civilization in history, with the most complex set of problems in history. The solutions to these problems will be equally complex. The idea that there are simple solutions is, in my opinion, a death trap. We have to think long, hard, quickly, and well. In the next and final episode of A World on the Brink, we will tackle the hardest subject of all, our future and what it might hold. We will examine how we might respond to some of the overarching issues and challenges that we face, the directions that we might take, and what might determine whether we succeed or fail.